Well, thanks everybody for coming. What I'm going to do is talk about the issue of climate change, and particularly I'm going to talk about the findings from the most recent National Climate Assessment. I led Volume 1 of the 4th National Climate Assessment. This is a report required by Congress that was based on the Global Change Act of 1990, actually signed by the first President Bush in 1992, and it requires that every so often we should, and it should be every 4 years, but it hasn't always been, has always happened that way, that we should have an assessment of what is happening to the Earth's climate, and what does that mean particularly to the United States, both in terms of the science and the resulting impacts on our society. And so that kind of sets the stage for looking at what's going on. Now, I thought maybe I would start with a quote from an old friend of mine, Sir David King. Sir David was the head of the chemistry department at Cambridge University for a number of years, and then became the chief scientist for the UK under two different prime ministers of the UK. And a few years ago, in talking about climate change, he says this is not only the biggest challenge of our time, this is the biggest challenge of all time. Something we all need to be taking very seriously. It's not only affecting us now, and it is affecting us. I don't think people always feel that, but it is happening. And it's farmers this year particularly feeling it in the Midwest because they haven't been able to get in their fields to plant the crops until very recently. But just clearly one of the most important issues. I often get attacked by those who don't want to accept the science, and as a result, sometimes I get asked to give debates, to be in a part of a debate about climate change. And I always say no, because there is no debate about the science. If you read the science, over 97% of the papers talk about how important this issue is. There's 12,000 papers a year written about climate change. And over 97. And those extra few percent, if you actually analyze them, you find out those are just garbage papers that never have appeared in the literature in the first place. There's a few rogue journals, and that's where they tend to appear. And so it really is nearly unanimous. And so there is no debate. Instead, what we should be debating about is the solutions. All people in the United States should be debating about how do we solve this problem before it really becomes devastating to us and to the other people around the world. So what is happening with our climate? Our climate is changing. It's changing extremely rapidly. In fact, it's changing about 10 times more rapidly than nature tends to change the climate. So if you look at the changes over the last century, and we now have temperatures we probably have not seen in at least the last 10,000 years and perhaps much, much longer, so it's really outside of the experience of humanity since we've had society as we know it. And because it's changing so rapidly, it's very difficult for humans and for nature to adapt to those changes. That's why it is so urgent, because it will have so many impacts. I always get asked, in fact, there was a recent AAAS in their blog where they asked people to comment on things. Somebody asked, well, why don't we focus on the things that are positive about climate change? So I told them, and then I got attacked afterwards because I did this. I sent in a response and I said, well, that's well and good, but we actually tried to do that in the National Climate Assessment, and we found out there just wasn't much. And the reason is because it's changing so rapidly. And so even if you find a few cold things that are good things, like there was less cold winters overall, then that has a response because fruit trees can't, as an example, may not get enough days when you're going to produce enough cherries or whatever. So there's always a negative side to the things you think are good. My big concern, I've been doing a lot of papers on this, is what's happening to severe weather. Severe weather is becoming more intense. We're getting more heat waves, so more multiple days of extreme heat. When we get more precipitation, and overall we're seeing a shift in precipitation. So here in the Midwest, we're seeing more precipitation we've had in the past, particularly in winter and spring, and drier summers overall. But more of that precipitation, when it comes anywhere in the world, is essentially coming as a larger event. Basically, a warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor. That's basic physics. And so it's not surprising that when you get more rain, or you get snow, that it'd be likely to be a larger event. Well, that's leading to more flooding when that occurs. And because of the shift in precipitation, we're also the drier tending to get drier. So we've got the growing concerns about drought in certain parts of our country and many parts of other parts of the world as well. And we could talk about a number of other things. Storms are getting more intense, hurricanes. This is a new finding based on one of my students, that hail is likely to become more intense as we're going forward. We don't have very good data on hail, but that's the indications. Sea levels are rising. So far they've risen about 7 to 8 inches over the last century. But we're seeing an acceleration in the rise. It used to be about a little over 1 millimeter per year increase through most of last century in terms of the rate of increase. Now it's rising by more than 3 millimeters per year, and we expect it to further accelerate. If you've been hearing the news lately, we're seeing highly unusual melting going on in Greenland and Antarctica. One of the big concerns, as I'll talk about in a second, is what's going on in West Antarctica. Now, as we look at the projections forward, over this century, we expect another 1 to 4 feet of sea level rise. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it will be devastating to many of our coastlines if we get as much as 2 to 3 feet. Yet, we can't for sure say that the risk isn't as high as 8 feet because of what's going on in West Antarctica, where the ice in the ocean that's holding up the glaciers in West Antarctica is melting rapidly. And there's a lot of concerns in the science community that if that goes, the glaciers are going to go, and that could rise sea levels up to 8 feet this century and much more than that over the next century. So it's going to be interesting to wait and see what happens there. Well, why are these things, and we're seeing a lot of other effects in the ocean, by the way. The oceans are warming. The ocean circulation is slowing down. It's not likely to stop this century, but it could in future centuries. Likely to have a big impact on the life in the ocean. The other factor is that reason for the increase is primarily because of the changing climate, is because of our burning of fossil fuels and land use change. It's increasing the amount of carbon dioxide and methane and other gases and particles in the atmosphere, and that's driving changes. Well, 25% of that increased amount of CO2 in the atmosphere goes into the oceans, and it's acidifying the oceans. It's making the oceans less basic. Well, that's having an effect already on shellfish. That extra little bit of acidity is having an effect. Well, how is that going to feed through the food chain in the oceans is not clear yet. Biologists are very worried about that. So we could go on and talk about the temperature change we've seen. So far, it's only been about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. We expect it could be as high as 8 to 10 degrees or so over this century if we continue the pathway we're on right now with the emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, et cetera. The president has called the high scenario that we look at a range of scenarios when we do these assessments. But the high scenario, they said, we shouldn't be looking at that. That's unrealistic. Well, right now, that's the pathway we're on. So I think it is realistic to look at that, because the question is, what is the world going to choose to do? what are the people going to choose for future emissions? So if we follow that pathway, we're talking about an extremely large effect. This is globally and annually averaged, and a similar amount happening in the U.S. But why is that important? It's averaged, globally and annually, but it ends up that if you went back and looked at the last ice age, that was about 15 degrees Fahrenheit colder than now. And what did we have then? We had hundreds of feet of ice above where we're standing right now. So that was a very different climate at 15 degrees. So if we're talking about 1.8 degrees now, that's already a big change in terms of warming. And by the end of the century, we could be talking about something as high as something comparable to the kind of cold that we had 20,000 years ago. One of the things we know is that the climate will continue to change because we cannot totally stop this, but we have choices. We basically have the choice to mitigate, to try to manage the unavoidable, to avoid the unmanageable, so we can mitigate, reduce emissions, and there's a number of ways we can do that. We can manage the unavoidable, which means we have to adapt, or we can suffer. And right now we're doing all three. Our choice for the future is which of those are we going to put our efforts in. We really need to both mitigate and adapt because that is what we're faced with. There are many things we can do as individuals. Probably the most important single thing is to make sure that our representatives are well aware of the importance of this issue so they start really doing something about it at the local, state, and national levels, and world levels. And how you vote makes a big difference. So I'm kind of preaching to the choir here because I think you all know how you're going to deal with this, but this is very important, and in fact, it could have as much as a 3 to 10% effect on our national domestic product over this century, which may not sound like much, but that would be a big factor in looking at the future economy of our nation. I'll leave it there and be happy to address anything you might have in the way of questions. Yes. So if you talk with different congressmen and senators, you'll find different answers to that question. I recently met with Sean Casten, for example, who was just voted in this last year, and I helped Sean answer a lot of questions while he was running for Congress. And he and others in the House have really taken it upon themselves to form a new climate caucus, and they're really trying to push this. Next month, I just led a special assessment of the impacts of climate change on the Great Lakes, and I'm going to DC in July, early July, to they've arranged briefings for the House and for the Senate. Now, who will show up? Some Democrats will show up, probably likely no Republicans, because that's typically what happens. Although I've been in a few of these things where a few Republicans hide in a corner of the room. But sometimes they do show up. And it's unfortunate, even when you do a testifying before a committee, often the other party doesn't show up for the testifying. But nonetheless, we're going to be doing this special briefing for them on the Great Lakes and climate and what it means to the American people and why we need to be acting. Yes.
Can you describe what your function was with the Obama administration?
Yeah, it didn't get mentioned in my bio, but I was at the White House the last 2 years of President Obama's term, and I was asked to be there by the President's science advisor, John Holdren, John called me in my office at the university one day asking me that he needed me at the White House. And my function was I was the climate science expert for the White House as they were developing the policies such as the Paris Agreement that were then put into place. Yes.
Sounds like to me our biggest problem is educating our leaders. If they can't show up to listen to you, how long is that speech going to take out of their lives? And aren't we paying them a huge amount of our tax dollars for a job that I wonder if half of them are spending 40 hours a week at?
Well,
Plus getting a hell of a retirement that I can't earn.
yeah.
They need to go there, and we need to
Based-
protest every single representative and listen to you.
Yeah. Based on everything I've seen, they do put in long hours, but I offered actually to bring in a group of major experts. I led volume 1 of the last National Climate Assessments, which is on the science of climate change. Right after we published that, I offered to bring in experts to the House and the Senate, half a dozen people that we would, to give a major briefing to them on climate change. And I basically was told there was no interest. So, yeah, so that's the way it was, yes. So let me tell you a bit about the Paris Agreement. When we were building the Paris Agreement, the folks at the Department of State, I thought were really smart, and they're the ones that did this, built in a clause into the Paris Agreement that no country could leave the agreement for 4 years. Well, you can guess why that was put in. And so at this point, the U.S. really has not withdrawn, despite any statements you hear otherwise, because it can't. Now, if this administration gets reelected, they could withdraw from it. I think it would be very foolish, and there's a lot of senators on both sides of the aisle that feel it's important that we continue within the Paris Agreement. I don't know much about this new thing, so I can't really comment upon it. Was this out of the House? Yeah, the problem is, as you know, we have a leader of the Senate who will do nothing. And so it'll be blocked. Yes. Many were planted in the last few weeks, so you're starting to see seeds coming up now. But oh no, I agree, and we're going to see more of that because, as I said, more precipitation coming in the spring as larger events, and a lot more precipitation in general. It's going to lead to more of these kind of things. And then the farmers are going to. I'm a farm boy. I grew up in southern Illinois on a farm. I always like to say my dad loved farming. And I learned at an early age that that was too much work, so decided to use my mind to go into science. But then we're going to get into the summers, which are expected to be drier. So you got warmer atmosphere, tending to lead to more evaporation, drier soils, and then on top of that, less rainfall. It could result in a significant decrease in farm yields by mid-century. In the National Climate Assessment, we said the reduction could be 10 to 30%. I've been part of papers where we said it actually could be as high as 50%. Well, at the same time, farmers are feeling like they're going to feed the world because we've got growing population. We have to produce more, and a lot of new genetic development starts trying to do that, but the climate may undo a lot of the things that they're trying to do. Yeah. Yeah. So I've long said that we need to consider nuclear power. Now, people are always asking, well, isn't it just hopeless? And I'd say no. I think that the revolution in energy and transportation has started. It's just that we're at the very beginning of it. So we have not seen hopefully over the next decade, we really need to be doing a lot, and hopefully we'll be making large transition in our energy. Renewables are going to be a big part of that. You know, solar and wind, just in the last year, have gotten to be as cheap, if not cheaper, than natural gas, and all three of those are much cheaper than coal. So coal doesn't make any sense economically anymore, and both solar and wind are going to get cheaper yet. So that's going to be a win-win. Geothermal is important, and I think nuclear is important. But I don't think it's traditional nuclear that's going to be important. I think it's going to be the new smaller reactors that are being developed that are probably going to change the whole nature of nuclear. I guess I don't feel that, but maybe that's because I'm being interviewed about 3 or 4, a couple times a day, typically anymore. So I'm seeing articles all the time talking about the urgency of climate change and what's happening around the world. So I don't think it's that way. I think the public are largely ignoring it. But I don't blame the media. I think the media is capturing. Now, there's certain media, such as the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, that always publish only the things that are kind of anti-environment. And when I and my colleagues try to publish something there, they ignore it, and it never gets seen. So that is an issue. But in general, I think the media is actually, kind of taking this on as one of the things that are important. So, I'm basing that on the fact that I see papers and listen to media from all over the world almost every day. So I actually yesterday I did a live TV program on a thing called RT America. Well, when we released the Great Lakes Assessment 2 months ago, I did interviews with NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN, Fox, and almost everybody. So they were covering it. Now, yeah, they don't bring it up every day, but I don't feel that they've been ignoring it myself. Yeah. Is that it? Okay. Thank you all.